Hello everybody, Marty McConnell, the Off-Grid Gecko here, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit rather than doing. I've got some footage of me doing this in the woods, but this is my first attempt at actually making a stone axe head. 2 hours to sit and grind down on this piece of rock. In that time, I've developed like a better understanding of how this process works, and I don't know if it's the other guys that do this maybe don't know how to communicate like what's going on, or if they don't understand the principle of what's going on, because I see people on YouTube trying to give instruction on this, and I see them just grinding away and using way more force than they need to use. The biggest misconception that I had about this entire process from the get-go had to do with hardness, because it doesn't have anything to do with how hard this rock is versus how hard the other rock is. So that was the first misconception I found, is all the rocks that I find that maybe would make a good axe are super hard, and then I can't find anything to grind about. It was just like a mental hang-up, but it's not, like I said, a scratching mechanism that's working on this. It's not like using a file to sharpen a knife, in other words. So let's talk about the mechanism for a minute. You will see these guys all recommend over and over, use sand, use gravel, use water, put it on your flat rock and rub on top of that, and the process will go faster. They don't really explain why, and the reason why is because you're not really scratching. What you're doing is basically hammering this rock smooth, but you're doing it with a million tiny little hammers, and you're making tiny little indentations in it, and it's basically, it's not smoothing it with a filing action so much, it's just chipping little bits off. You know, your mill bastard file, and you run this along the edge, it scrapes off little bits of metal, okay? And those little bits of metal just go flying up, and they like accumulate by you. So your file doesn't wear down because it's harder than the knife, and it's sharp, so every time you scratch it across there, it literally scratches little pieces off of the knife. That's not the same mechanism that you use when you're shaping rocks. So you start with your stone that's kind of square shaped on the end like this, okay, and then you've got your flat slab underneath. If you were to grind this across there, these two are rubbing against each other, and you would be trying to use that scraping motion to just literally scrape a little bit of this rock off at a time. What's actually happening is when you put the sand down there, you've got all these different shaped little pebbles and rocks, and they're all different sizes. So you got some little sandy stuff, you got some bigger rocks. I even had some little flakes in there that were like ½ an inch in diameter, laying on that rock. And most of these pieces, because they're broken pieces that get washed down the river, are sharp on the end. So when you rub this against here, what's actually happening is it's rolling along, like these little pieces are actually rolling and turning, and each time they turn, they hammer against the bottom of this, and they chip little chunks out of it, like little microscopic chunks. It's like just some weird shape. Well, when this touches it, you'll be hitting on this piece right here, say, okay? And as you move to the right, this guy's going to roll forward, and this is why you don't want to apply too much pressure, because you need to be able to get these pieces underneath your working surface. So this guy's going to roll forward, and then as it does, this next little point is going to come up, and it's going to hit your what you're trying to turn into an axe, your source rock, and it's going to hit it, and then it's going to roll forward a little more, and it's going to hit it again, and it's going to hit it again and again and again. And as that happens, little bits of this are going to get broken off, you know, on both sides, because it's hammering down and up, and little bits of this are going to get broken off, okay? Now, because these two are relatively flat surfaces, if you're trying to chip into a flat piece of rock, you're not going to have as much success as if you're trying to bust a corner off. And you can test that theory by basically taking any rock and just smacking it against another one at an angle, and you'll chip off little pieces of the edge. Whereas if you just take another rock, use this wood for an example, and you bash into it, you're still going to be chipping little flakes out, but they're going to be much smaller because of the geometries involved, basically. So this, you'll chip out, and that little piece of wood right there, it's way softer than a rock will ever be, just pulled out a little chunk of this that dropped on the ground, about the size of a grain of sand. So even using a piece of wood, which is much, much softer than any stone, you can actually get this chipping action out of here. Now this is the same, so instead of being a grinding motion, this is the same kind of technique that's used in the oil field for drilling. If you ever look at a oil field drill bit, or you look up a picture of one, you've usually got your threads, and then you've got a little collar, and then there's usually a spot down here at the bottom that's kind of shaped like this, and then on each one of these little bits you've got a round disc, and each of these discs has little bitty teeth running out of it. So as this hits the bottom of a well bore, this thing's turning, these rollers are turning, and these sharp teeth are basically hammering down at the bottom rock that you're trying to get through. So this is how rock bits work, right? Is not so much a grinding action. The original rock bit was designed to have this sort of hammering action. So it hammers away at the bottom, and you break free these little chunks. And then it's got jets of water that come out of the bottom and wash those little chunks of rock cutting out of the way, so that it can continue hammering away. Same exact process here, just a little less refined. So if you are applying too much pressure when you're grinding away with this, what you're effectively doing is, instead of rolling these little chunks of sharp sand underneath here to hammer away at it, instead of doing that, you'll be coming down here flat and level with the surface, and your little chunks of sand are all up here, and you're basically pushing them out of the way and trying to force this to grind and scrape against the bottom rock. So you basically defeat the purpose of having this little sand pile here by doing that. So it's funny that so many people recommend using sand and water, but then you'll see them just apply. I mean, you can tell their muscles are flexing and they're just scraping into the rock, and every time they push it across, it cleans the slate, so to speak. Whereas what you actually want to do is keep a little pile of that miniature rubble underneath the part that you're cutting at all times. Okay, so it sounds a little weird, and hopefully I can inject some of the video of me actually doing this to kind of help you see a little bit. Now what water does is it lubricates this process. So I haven't found an exact amount of water yet, but as you work, like I said, you're going to make these little particles finer and finer and finer. Well, when weathering erodes sand, rocks, and all these other things in nature, it forms clays. And clays are basically mineral soil deposits that are just busted up rock that's so tiny that the little grains can kind of interact with each other. And there's some other little forces going on there, but basically that's what it is. It's like a really fine silt or a fine clay that you're creating. And so you'll have something that looks like a mixture of silt and clay after you do this process long enough. And because of that, like, water gets absorbed onto those little pieces. Another misconception about this whole deal is the amount of water that you actually need. So normally you'll see somebody like me or somebody else doing this down by a stream bed. It's not necessarily necessary, okay? Not necessarily necessary. You just have to have enough water on hand to lubricate these little bits of sand, and you have to have enough sand, small particles, fine gravel, whatever you want to call it, available to kind of feed this process. Now the same process is also used in a rock tumbler. So a rock tumbler basically spins and spins and spins, and you've got various different sizes of grit in there that are hammering against your stone that you're trying to polish. And over time, they just break away at it and break away at it and break away at it. And because they're so small and they're taking off such a little bit at a time, you end up with a very polished looking rock, which is exactly the same principle that we're applying here. We're just applying this in situ without having machinery hooked up, without automating any of these processes. Okay, so in theory, you could take any rock from your backyard, find some kind of flat rock, or even, I'm going to test this theory to prove it, but I would venture to guess that you could use a cement block as your grinding surface. You're like, oh, wait a minute, you start wearing against a cement block, it's just going to wear out. No, yeah, it will, but just because it's porous and it's soft and it breaks easy and you can pretty much scrape away at it with a file and tear it up easily, I mean, it will still work for this process. In fact, the fact that it's porous will allow you to use bigger chunks of rock to grind your stone down, chunks that are more effective. So instead of applying pressure, what you want to do is apply speed, because as you're rolling across all those little bits of sand, the faster you're going, the faster these little bits of sand are going to be turning, and the more force that they're going to be hitting your deal with. And as you continue to do this little mixture of clay and stuff, if you get it wet and then you add more sand to it, this actually acts as sort of a matrix to float those sharp pieces of rock above your subsurface a little bit. So instead of grinding away like this, what you're doing is you're actually riding on a cushion of silt that's got little chunks of sand and sharp rock embedded in it. And as you glide across that cushion, the water that you add is going to allow these pieces to move and roll within that matrix. Whereas if this dries out too much, then you're going to be kind of fighting yourself against that, because you can push over them, but they don't want to roll, they don't want to move. So in effect, you're creating a sandpapery surface to grind against again. So that's where the water comes into play. But after a while, after 15 or 20 minutes, like if you understand this concept and that you're not just trying to grind this thing down against a file, you're trying to actually like beat it up and pound it into submission rather than scraping off little bits at a time. It doesn't matter how hard this rock is. It doesn't matter how hard your flat rock is. It doesn't even matter how hard these little grains are. As long as they're hard enough to make a dent, like I said, you can chip this with a piece of wood, believe it or not. In fact, if you're flint knapping and you get a couple of hardwood pieces, you can smack at these edges, and I mean, just taking that, just a couple whacks at the edge of this, I can see little bits of rock just flaking off and falling on the ground. This is a hammering effect, which is not the same as a grinding effect. And just understanding that concept, number one, it'll take a lot of the workload away, because instead of using all your energy and sweat to bear down on this thing, this becomes a trivially easy task of literally just sitting there and kind of swishing this around. I mean, you could do it while you're watching television, listening to your headphones, just watching nature. I had a couple dogs come down to visit me while I was doing this yesterday, and I was just watching them run around and play and just grinding my little rock and sitting there and relaxing, and you know, it's trivially easy. So I can see like people in the Stone Age maybe sitting around the campfire at night with nothing to do after they're done eating, waiting to go to bed, and just working on their tools like this. It's the same as sanding a piece of wood with sandstone, just to kind of smooth and even everything out, or working on it with a sharp piece of flint to shape something. You know, it's like a downtime. You're already on downtime, so you're going to go ahead and kill some time and, you know, work on your tools a little bit before you go to sleep. One more thing I want to talk about, and then I'll be done, is the type of rock that you want to use. Okay, so we've already covered it doesn't matter how hard the rock is. So I've been scared to death of using a chunk of quartz, because quartz is going to grind anything that I put it against, except for maybe a really hard granite or something that's got little bits of diamond impregnated in it. I mean, quartz is essentially glass. It's really high hardness for a rock. The finer the grain structure is here, the finer the edge you're going to be able to make on your rock. So essentially you want something that has really tight grain, okay, and is fairly strong. the hardness, again, almost any rock you find is going to be harder than the tree that you're cutting into. So hardness should be a secondary priority. It's important, and hardness usually comes with smaller grain size, but it should be a secondary priority. Your priority should be finding a tough rock. You can have a super hard material and still get a nice smooth polish on it just by going through this motion and doing this thing and understanding how it works. This doesn't need to be a complicated endeavor. It wasn't a complicated endeavor 10,000 years ago, and if you're burning too many calories trying to do something with primitive technology, chances are you're doing it wrong, because burning calories, like, you don't want to wear yourself out to make a fire or to make a tool. Like, you should be wearing yourself out to find food and water and survive, not wasting 2 days sweating over a tool and needing more resources brought in than what you're actually getting out of it to make it. I'm going to be experimenting with this a lot more, and hopefully I'll be able to give a better tutorial at some point, but this was one of those things that just occurred to me, and all the little pieces made sense in my mind all at once, and I was like, why has nobody just come out and said this? So I'm coming out and saying this. Hopefully that'll enable you, encourage you, if you've ever thought about doing this. It's not going to be a lot of hard work. It's actually a pretty relaxing time. Just bring a soda or a cup of coffee and just sit there and chill and work on your rock. Anyway, my camera's overheating, and I probably have like an hour of video to cut out of this because I've been rambling the whole time. And it's not going to be easy because I've been talking fast too. So, excuse me. Like, subscribe, and join me for more fun. We'll be doing more of this, and then hopefully doing a tutorial on this soon, so stay tuned for that. And we'll talk to you later. Bye.